All right, let's dive right into this explainer. When we think of ancient Buddhism, our minds almost automatically go straight to those majestic Pure Land images, deep meditation, and just serene spirituality, right? But what if I told you that right behind that serene exterior was an incredibly grounded, earthy, and honestly, remarkably bureaucratic reality? Today, we're unpacking an ancient text called the Ten Recitations Vinaya, specifically Scroll 27. And what it reveals is just absolutely fascinating. Because it turns out managing hundreds of ancient monks wasn't all chanting and enlightenment. It was basically an ancient version of a human resources department, trying to deal with highly practical, very human problems.
So think about this. Why do Buddhist monks wear those patchwork robes? We see this iconic look all the time, and it's so easy to just assume it's purely some deep mystical symbolism. But here's the hook. The historical mystery behind this look reveals it wasn't just symbolic at all. It was actually a highly practical, totally reactive solution to a very everyday problem. We're going to treat the rules of the Buddha almost like corporate case files today, just to see exactly how these iconic traditions were born completely out of necessity.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 6 of these case files: the origin of monastic robes, practicality and the elements, the generosity of lay patrons, regulating the dress code, greed and the robe loophole, and finally, human nature and rules. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the origin of monastic robes. Okay, so let's set the scene in ancient India. In the very early days, the Buddha's followers didn't actually have a standardized uniform. They were essentially just wandering ascetics. Now, this created a major identification problem, because honestly, it was really hard to tell them apart from the naked ascetics of totally different sects. According to the text, King Bimbisara was out riding his elephant one morning, super eager to pay his respects to a Buddhist monk. He spots someone in the distance, orders his whole entourage to stop, gets down, and deeply respectfully bows, only for his minister to frantically whisper that he had literally just bowed to a naked ascetic from a completely different religion. The king was, as you can imagine, deeply embarrassed. He went straight to the Buddha and practically begged him to create a uniform so he could tell who was who. The Buddha agreed. Later on, while looking at a neatly divided rice paddy field in the South Mountain country, he told his attendant, Ananda, to design a robe cut and sewn together in that exact patchwork pattern. It was literally an ancient ID badge. But what's really wild is where they actually sourced this fabric. To keep the monks humble and completely detached from materialism, they couldn't just go out and buy fine textiles. They had to scavenge. The Buddha explicitly allowed 4 specific types of discarded cloth, literally known as dirt rags. This included graveyard cloth used to wrap the dead, brought-out cloth given from the deceased, ownerless cloth just found abandoned in fields, and literal dirt cloth or rags just thrown in the trash. They would take these super austere, unwanted scraps, wash them, and sew them into that rice paddy patchwork uniform. Moving right along to Section 2, practicality and the elements. Now, it wasn't just social awkwardness dictating these rules, it was sheer survival. The harsh weather in ancient India directly shaped this rulebook, and it answers a very specific question about how much clothing a monk was actually allowed to own. Why exactly 3 robes? Well, the source text tells this vivid story of the Buddha traveling to the country of Vaishali during the dead of winter. And the text describes the cold wind at night as piercing enough to literally break bamboo. So the Buddha decided to sit outside and test the extremes of the weather himself. In the first part of the night, he wore one single patchwork robe. By the middle of the night, he was absolutely freezing, so he put on a second. And by the final stretch of the early morning, the chill was just unbearable, so he added a third. Having physically tested the limit of human endurance himself, he gathered the monks and declared, "You are allowed exactly 3 robes, no more, no less. If you have less, it's an offense. If you hoard more, it's an offense." It was just the perfect pragmatic balance between surviving the bitter cold and preventing materialistic hoarding. Which brings us to Section 3, the generosity of lay patrons. As the Buddhist community grew, so did its wealthy fan base, and that strict, scavenging lifestyle began to seriously clash with the generosity of wealthy followers who genuinely just wanted to donate beautiful things. This actually led to an absolute public relations disaster. A highly devoted, wealthy laywoman named Visakha invited the Buddha and the monks over for a meal. She sends her maid to the monastery to tell them the food is ready. Well, there had just been a massive rainstorm. The monks, wanting to wash off, but definitely not wanting to ruin their precious 3 robes, were all bathing in the rain completely naked. The maid takes one look through the gate, turns right around, runs back to her boss, and says, "There are no monks there, just a bunch of naked heretics."
Visakha, who was very sharp, realized exactly what was happening. She went to the Buddha and basically said, "Look, this is a bad look for us. Please let me donate specific rain-bathing robes for the monks." She also mentioned that lay women were mocking the nuns for bathing naked in the river, so she requested to donate water-bathing clothes for the nuns too. The Buddha, ever the pragmatist, agreed, allowing these exceptions just to avoid a massive public scandal. So that leads us perfectly into Section 4, regulating the dress code. But hey, as any HR manager will tell you, if you give an inch, people will take a mile. Once the Buddha allowed donated fabrics and those extra bathing robes, the monks started getting incredibly creative. This forced the Buddha to issue strict, almost corporate-level regulations. He had to explicitly clarify what was allowed and what was forbidden. Linen, silk, hemp, and coarse wool, approved. But he literally had to write a rule saying you cannot wear owl feathers, animal skins, woven grass, or tree bark. Why? Because some monks were actively trying to adopt the eccentric, fringe garments of other extreme ascetic sects. The Buddha had to step in and say, no, wearing owl feathers is an offense. It makes you look like an outsider. He had to keep the brand consistent. And the dress code violations weren't just about materials. They were about sizing too. The text shares this genuinely funny anecdote about Nanda, who was actually the Buddha's half-brother. Nanda was apparently quite tall and looked a whole lot like the Buddha. So he decided to make his robes the exact same dimensions as the Buddha's robes. Now, when Nanda would walk into the dining hall, the elder monks would see this tall figure in a massive robe from afar, think it was the Buddha, and immediately stand up to bow, only to realize, nope, it was just Nanda. The elder monks were super annoyed. Nanda was embarrassed, and the Buddha had to mandate that absolutely no one was allowed to cut a robe to the exact measurements of the master. This sparked a very classic problem-reaction cycle. The monks realized they were allowed extra fabric for specific medical or practical reasons, right? Like a cloth to cover a festering boil or a sitting mat to protect their bedding. But some monks totally exploited these allowances to hoard fabric. They literally started making massive, oversized boil covers and gigantic sitting mats. The Buddha caught wind of this, brought everyone together, and laid down the law. He instituted exact measurements. Rain clothes could only be 6 by 2.5 spans. Boil covers, exactly 4 by 2 spans. Sitting mats, 2 by 1.5 spans. If you made them larger, it was an official offense. It is honestly amazing how much this mirrors modern compliance regulations. All right, Section 5, greed and the robe loophole. We've reached the climax of our explainer, because even with all these precise measurements and rules, human greed absolutely still enters the chat. This comes in the form of a monk named Upananda, who is quite simply the ultimate ancient loophole finder. Check out his brilliant, if highly unethical, scam. Step 1. There was a monastery where only 2 elderly monks had stayed for the entire summer retreat. The local lay people donated a huge pile of high-quality robes just for them, but the 2 old monks were completely paranoid. They didn't know how to divide such a large pile equally without breaking a rule, so they just left it sitting there arguing over it. Step 2. Upananda, who was literally traveling around specifically looking for monasteries with lots of loot, arrives. He sees the old monks arguing and says, "Hey, I know the law. Let me mediate this for you." Step 3. Upananda splits the robes into 3 piles. He gives 1 pile to each old monk and then points to the third, most valuable pile and says, "And this one is for the mediator who knows the law, which is me." He scooped up the absolute best robes and just walked out, leaving the old monks completely stunned. Well, when the other monks found out, they were absolutely furious and reported him immediately. The Buddha didn't just scold Upananda, he publicly shamed him with a fable. He told the story of 2 otters who caught a massive fish in a river but couldn't agree on how to share it. A cunning jackal walks by and offers to help. The jackal recites this exact poem. "Into the shallows gets the tail, into the deep should get the head. The middle flesh between the two goes to the one who knows the law." The jackal takes the meaty body of the fish for himself and just runs off, leaving the otters with nothing but the head and the tail. The Buddha looked right at Upananda in front of everyone and said, "The 2 old monks are the otters, and you, Upananda, are the jackal." And that brings us to our final part, Section 6, Human Nature and Rules. You see, all of these specific, seemingly tedious regulations weren't there just to restrict spiritual growth. They were actually formed as a protective framework to guard the community against the Upanundas of the world. To stop his specific scam, the Buddha laid down a definitive, highly practical rule. Monks can only receive robe distributions from the specific location where they actually completed their summer retreat. Meaning, if you spent the summer at Monastery A, you get your share of donations from Monastery A. You absolutely cannot go retreat hopping around the country, dropping in on other monasteries right as they're dividing up their seasonal donations to collect multiple payouts. It was a brilliant, airtight policy that basically closed the loophole of greed once and for all. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. Over 2,000 years later, how do these ancient solutions to human nature mirror our modern legal systems and our HR departments? What you should really take away from all this is that whether you are wearing a patchwork dirt robe in ancient India or a suit in a modern corporate office, human practicality, that innate instinct to find loopholes, and our fundamental need for structured guidelines, yeah, they really haven't changed in millennia. It makes you wonder, what modern rules are we writing today that will look just as fascinatingly human 2,000 years from now? Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the origins of the world around you.